Hello, and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host, Weebunion, and in this one we have several Russian advances all throughout the front line. The Russians have advanced in the Kreminna section of the front line, in the Siversk section of the front line, within the city of Toretsk, near Kurov in the northern section, in the Volodar section of the front line, and further within Kamyansk in the south. Starting out in the north, the Russians have advanced in the direction south of Nevsky in the direction of Novosadove, as the Russians expand their zone of control to cut off the forest lines here southeast of Nevsky, where the Russians are attacking the Ukrainian positions from the northwestern direction, and will likely combine that with an assault from the southern direction as well to pincer the Ukrainian forces within the forest lines and cut off their supplies to push them out towards Novosadove, or encircle them as they attack towards Novosadove directly from Nevsky and from the east as well. Novosadove itself is a small settlement with hardly any buildings, if there are any, and that means that the Ukrainians do not have any significant positions within it. Most of the positions defending the area is generally located around the crossing here by the northwest of Novosadove and along the forest lines east of the settlement. The Russians will likely gain control over this area fairly quickly due to the lack of Ukrainian presence within the area, and they'll focus their forces towards Terny in a northern direction and eastern direction, similar to the fighting that has taken place earlier. The Russians have previously attacked Terny and Yampolivka, both reaching the outskirts of it, potentially gaining a foothold, after which it was pushed out by a Ukrainian counterattack, pushed them all the way to where the front line was. Now the Russians have restarted offensive operations following the capture of Nevsky and Makivka further north. They're also developing offensive operations generally in this area. Further south in the Siversk section of the front line, we have two large advances by the Russians. The Russians managed to capture the remaining parts of Kamyansk, gaining full control of it, as is seen with this geolocated footage here, reaching the outskirts of the settlement. And in the northern parts, the Russians have broken through Bilhorivka to reach Ryurivka along the high ground in the northeastern parts of Siversk. So we see that the Siversk front has been activated after a very long time of stalemate fighting, and the Russians are generally doing a lot of positional fighting continuously, just at a faster pace. But the objective is to gain control over the fortified positions of the Ukrainians ahead of the defensive line of the Ukrainians near Siversk, improving their positions, likely going to be flanking the Ukrainian fortified positions by even Derivka to gain control of that, and create a proper front line where they get a proper overlook over the settlement of Siversk and the general positions of the Ukrainians within the area, heavily bombarding them ahead of an assault towards the settlement. It is becoming clear that the Russians, due to the large Ukrainian concentration of forces in the Pokrovsk, Kurov, and generally the southern parts of the Donetsk section of the front line, are now focusing a lot more on their efforts in the northern parts, taking advantage of the Ukrainian forces being spread out, and the Siversk front, which was unmovable for a very long time, for many years now, has now been activated again due to this relocation of troops. Something very interesting is someone close to the Ukrainian military who has talked and been in Ukraine, different areas, recently said that the Ukrainian units are heavily relying on the artillery and drones to hold back the Russian advances. It is not uncommon for Ukrainian units to only be staffed at about 20% of their fighting capabilities. That means many times the settlements are actually empty. There are a few soldiers by the fortified positions, but the settlements themselves are empty until the Ukrainians send in some reinforcements from fresh units to hold the line, which usually happens after a Russian attempt. The Ukrainians try to hold back a Russian advance by having drones flying around the clock and doing concentrated artillery strikes or FPV drone strikes on the Russian forces to prevent their advances. And if it looks like they're making a larger advance, they'll send in units to take up positions. The reason for this is that drone operators rarely die in comparison to many of the other units, and this means that generally, while the attrition for frontline units is much higher, drone operators hardly are wounded or casualties in general. So there's plenty of drone operators, and if there's plenty of drones as well, the majority of those 20% of the forces could simply be drone operators and artillery operators, while there's hardly any frontline units. This can also explain why in the Pokrovsk section of the front line, at some point during the defense of Novorodivka, Deep State Map complained that the mechanized brigade fighting in the area was sending drone operators to the front lines to hold the trenches. That is simply because they had no more frontline units to sit in the trenches, and the only units they had were drone operators, and if they were running low on drones, the drone operators had nothing to do, might as well be sitting in the trenches, is likely what the commander based his actions on. Now moving on to the Toretsk section of the front line, there are several advances here as well. The Russians are advancing within the central parts of the city, both towards the stadium, through the apartment complex area, and in throughout the residential area. The Russians have also gained a foothold within the industrial area, where they've managed to capture the first buildings and are fighting over the industrial area itself. So we see that the main parts of Toretsk, I've always said there are three main parts. There's the apartment complex area in the center, there's the industrial area in the western parts, and then there are these hills. These three positions, if the Russians gain control over these, then Toretsk would be the beginning of the end of the city, as the Russians would have all of the most important parts. Now we're seeing that the Russians are close towards connecting the two sides by the industrial area and the southern flank. At the same time, we also see that they have entered the industrial area and they've gained control over the majority of the apartment complex area. In general, the Ukrainian positions in Toretsk are very critical, and this lack of manpower really shows with these developments. It is likely that towards this current state, the Ukrainians will send whatever they have left of manpower towards Toretsk to attempt to at least hold some of it or delay the Russian advances as much as possible. They may simply rely on taking up positions here on the outskirts and the high ground overlooking the city, and mainly focus on drone operators to deal with the Russian positions. This also explains an advance such as the one the Russians made into Leonidivka. The Ukrainians simply did not have any soldiers within the settlement. They only had drone operators and artillery. This is why the Russian unit managed to get inside of Leonidivka, yet they never really lost their foothold, and the Russians just went on to capture Leonidivka despite this area by Leonidivka being vulnerable, and it's simply because the Ukrainians did not have enough soldiers to launch a counterattack or to push the Russians out. Instead, they likely have a few soldiers by the fortified positions in the high ground northwest of the area, and mainly rely on drone operators and artillery located further back. When the 12th Azov Brigade arrived to do some counterattacks here in the New York direction, we initially saw some counterattacks by the Ukrainians. They recaptured some territory, they re-entered the industrial zone, possibly to get some of the units out. But other than that, we saw no actual combat by the 12th Azov Brigade. They simply continued with drone strikes, which they made a lot of, but nothing else. And this clearly indicates that whatever they had to push towards New York was the only thing they had. Moving on to the Kurov section of the front line, we see that the Russians have captured the residential area south of Shelanedruhe, and with this they are now much closer to completely closing off this pocket. The Russians will likely move towards Soriane or simply hold their positions here. There's no reason for them to go closer. Any Ukrainian positions within the east of this is within close fire control of the Russian forces. This will also allow the Russians to then push towards Alexandropol to gain control over that, closing off the area to the south, before having the entire area east of the Vovcha River line closed off from the Ukrainian forces. At the same time, positional fighting continues here near Kremenebelka, Novoselidivka, and Ismailivka, as the Russians pressure the Ukrainian positions in the area. In the Volosar section, we see that the Russians have advanced north of the settlement, capturing a forest patch and more of the road in the northern direction. The Russians are here looking to close off this area north of Volodar before pushing on towards Bohoyavlenka to capture fortified positions and storm the settlement itself. In the Kamyansky direction, the Russians have expanded their foothold within the settlement, as we see with this located footage of Ukrainians shelling Russian positions within the area. And again, the general trend, what we see throughout the front line, is that the Russians simply advance into Ukrainian settlements, They don't meet a lot of resistance within the settlements. Instead, there is just a lot of drone warfare, there's a lot of artillery warfare on their positions. In my opinion, what we're seeing is that the Ukrainian military force, the conventional one, the one if we ignore artillery and drones, is almost non-existent. The majority of the fighting force they had available, they simply sent to the Kursk direction. I have heard from several sources now that the Ukrainian manpower shortage is so dire that in some units they range between 30 to 1% staffed, and the new ones who come in are hardly trained. They do not have nearly enough training to hold frontline positions, either because their role was something else completely, like being a driver, or because they weren't properly trained. These soldiers are not capable of fighting near the front line. And we are also seeing a lot more mutinies among the Ukrainian army, where soldiers simply refuse to fight. Like when the Territorial Defense Brigade, which was supposed to clear up the Volodar to cover for the 72nd Mechanized Brigade, they simply didn't go in. They abandoned their positions. This is why the Ukrainians want to mobilize another 200,000 soldiers. They hope for a reset this fall and winter season. It seems, according to weather forecasts, that the rain will start this week in Ukraine, and likely the mud season will begin. That means it may be limited how much more the Russians can advance, considering the situation that the Ukrainians still have a lot of drone operators and artillery that they can use to stall the Russian forces, while the Ukrainians mobilize their new batch of soldiers who are going to be sitting in the trenches near the front lines. In general, there's also difference between frontline to frontline, but in general, the Donetsk region is scarcely manned, and there's not nearly enough soldiers to cover the positions in the region. And this is what has led to the numerous Russian advances, and it is also likely that due to this fact, the amount of casualties that the Russians take are entirely based on the FPV and artillery strikes. There's hardly any other type of casualty that the Russians are taking. Even systems such as the HIMARS system is hardly viable for the Ukrainians anymore, because the Russians have found numerous ways to counter it. There's of course many mistakes, such as one which was taken in Kursk, where a lot of Russian soldiers suffered from the inability of a commander to use more than one brain cell. But that is an exception rather than the rule here 2.5 years into the conflict. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, and check out my Patreon for additional content. Thank you all for watching, and have a great day.